Good evening. My name is Justin Gacho, and I am the Vice President of the Savannah Council of World Affairs, and I'm filling in this evening for Jim Van Epps and Jose de la Cruz, who are both up at the World Affairs Councils of America National WACA Conference in Washington, D.C., trying to find us more speakers for future programs and things. So I'd like to welcome you to our November program, and I'm very impressed with the crowd we have tonight, and it's because we have a wonderful topic and a wonderful speaker. So we have a few business things to take care of, and the first is to talk about our sponsors. Our platinum sponsor is Kreitz Auto Group, which has served Savannah and the Coastal Empire, the area, for 80 years. And I think everybody knows that Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes, and Sprinter vans specialize in used and certified pre-owned vehicles. And our other sponsor tonight is Susan Catron and The Current. And Susan is also on our board. Where is Susan? Thank you, Susan. And we can't do this without our sponsors, and we can't do this without you as members of the Savannah Council of World Affairs. We're an all-volunteer council, and we're nonpartisan, and we welcome your full participation. Being an all-volunteer council, we need all the help we can get. All right, a little piece of business tonight. I'd like Jennifer Dyer to come up and talk to us about a very important program that's coming up, The Great Decisions, which you might enjoy.
Hi there. Oh, gosh. I get a clap for standing up. I like it. Easy group. So I am Jennifer Dwyer. I'm on the board here. I happen to be in charge for this year of a program called the Great Decisions Program. The Foreign Policy Association puts together materials on 8 topics every year, and groups discuss them locally. So the Savannah Council on World Affairs is sponsoring 3 different discussion groups. One's on Sunday afternoon, one's on Tuesday evening, and one is on Wednesday, sort of mid 4 to 5:30, something about that. If you haven't already signed up and are interested in learning about the Great Decisions Program, there are handouts on the program over here. There are also sign-ups, and all of the materials include my email address. If you'd like to sign up, send me an email, and I'll put you on the roster. We have almost filled one group, and but we do have some seats in the group. So if you're interested, please read the materials, sign up, or reach out to me. Thank you very much.
I'm facilitating the one at the Learning Center in April, running through May. And a little bit more about the Great Decisions Program. Each December, they're probably they're getting ready to put the topics together now, and then it'll come out, and they'll do the research, and it'll be very up to date, and the Great Decision support material will come out in January. And this year's topic has included Mideast realignment, climate technology and competition, science across borders, U.S.-China trade rivalry, talking about timely, NATO's future, understanding Indonesia, if you can understand it, let me know, high seas treaties, and pandemic preparedness. So if you'd like to discuss those with a group of your peers from over the course of the spring, starting in the winter and on to spring at the Learning Center, just sign up or get in touch with Jennifer, and she can give you more information about the Great Decisions Program. Thank you. And now I'd like to go a little bit ahead of ourselves and have Larry come talk about our upcoming December program.
Thank you, Justin. It's really great to see this room so crowded and to see all the students here as well. I just wanted to mention that I think you'll find our program on December 7th. I know it's earlier in the month, obviously, to stay away from the holidays, to be really very, very interesting, insightful, and an open discussion with Ambassador Ron Newman. He's a 3-time U.S. ambassador, former colleague of mine, Afghanistan, Albania, Bahrain, where he was ambassador. And Ambassador Newman is traveling around the country to talk about a study. He is president of what's called the American Academy of Diplomacy in Washington, which is the association that many former ambassadors, former 3-star, 4-star generals, and others belong to promote diplomacy. They've done a great study on what our diplomats do, more importantly, what the future is, what they should be doing, what they can do better, from training to how they conduct negotiations, and the kind of support they need from Washington. So this group, the American Academy, in some ways lobbies any administration, they're nonpartisan, as well as Congress, on what do we need for our budget in diplomacy, for your diplomats in the field, to support your military in the field, and to support U.S. business, by the way, overseas. There's a lot of this is commercial diplomacy. So I encourage you, if you can, to make it on December 7th and at 7:30 for Ambassador Ron Newman. Thank you.
Well, I see my phone out here. Make sure yours is off so we can, or on stun, so we not interrupt Susan's program. Tonight's program, and I'm going to make this a very brief introduction of a very impressive resume, which you probably have all received by email. The International Migration and the Challenges of Seeking Asylum in the United States. Dr. Susan Terrio is our lecturer tonight, doing our program, and we're honored to have her here. As she says, there are now not just the 12 million people at our southern border, but 100 million people or more displaced globally, and more coming to be displaced. So, and right at the moment, approximately 17,700 people received asylum based on a well-founded fears of persecution in their home country. This was the lowest number, that was from last year, and that was the lowest number since in the 1990s. So we have over 1 million people, well over 1 million people seeking asylum now, and and that number is climbing every day. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Susan Terrio.
Hello, can you all hear me? Thank you. So I'm sure you're wondering why I'm sitting instead of standing. I had surgery 2 days ago, so I'm hoping that my voice will hold up. And I do appreciate seeing all of you and seeing so many familiar faces. So let me start. Instead of going straight to the topic of the challenges in seeking asylum, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the research that I've done that is really very involved with asylum. The book Forced Out is coming out in January of 2024. The idea of that book came from a conference that I attended at the University of the District of Columbia in 2017. There were 2 immigration attorneys there who described the egregious due process violations and the bad mistreatment in 3 immigration prisons where migrant mothers who had fled horrific violence in their homelands, their countries of origin, had fled. And the attorneys were begging people they needed volunteers to travel to South Texas, where 2 of the largest immigration prisons are, to be trained as legal assistants to help these mothers who were seeking asylum, and when they got over the border were immediately put in these private immigration prisons. So they wanted volunteers who could help the women pass their credible fear interview, which is the very first stage in seeking asylum, and that's what we did. I went there in 2017 and 2018, and our job, as I said, was to elicit the life stories of these women and also sit next to them when they had their credible fear interviews. The asylum officers were stationed within that immigration prison. So that gave me some real insight into the first stage of seeking asylum. So going back in time, these 2 books have to do with another population that's equally vulnerable. These have to do with unaccompanied, the term of art was alien minors, who came by themselves or with other people, fleeing horrific violence, often in their homes or in their communities in their neighborhoods, seeking refuge, and also wanting to reunify with family members, many of whom were already in the United States. So what happened to them if they were lucky enough to get across Mexico and across our militarized border? They were apprehended by immigration authorities, and they were taken to detention facilities that are managed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So that was one part. And then at the same time, they were put into removal proceedings in immigration courts where they had no legal representation. So that experience was really important because I got permission not only to do on-site visits within the closed facilities, but also to observe immigration court proceedings. So that really gave me an insight into the system. So instead of discussing those books, I want to step back and look at the system as it exists currently and how it has evolved over the past 15 or 20 years, particularly since the challenges in seeking asylum have gotten much more difficult. Meds I'm on, I have to keep drinking water. Alrighty, so this is just to tell you the number of interviews that I've done, the work as a legal assistant in these immigration prisons, and I was also a visitation volunteer in 2 Georgia prisons. We have 6 immigration prisons in this country, and I'm sure many of you don't know that, but they don't have the same capacity to train people to be legal assistants. But the people who are incarcerated in these prisons, they're located in very remote areas. It's very difficult for their families to see them and to have any contact with them in person. So these visitation volunteers were very important to their morale. And as Justin said it in his introduction, 2022 was a watershed year in terms of the people who were displaced globally. For all of the push factors that you've heard if you've been watching the media, armed conflict, political turmoil, and violence by state and non-state actors. So what's the bottom line? Global protection has hit an all-time peak, while public support for refugees and asylees goes up and down. But the thesis that I'm going to develop tonight has to do with destination countries like the United States, like Great Britain, like Australia, and like many countries in the Western Europe that have very evolved human rights standards and established judicial procedures for assessing protection claims. But they're taking actions to prevent all migrants, including asylum seekers, from entering their territories legally and for petitioning for protection. So just a few minutes to get the legal frameworks in our heads. So in 1951, obviously after the turmoil of the Second World War, where many different geographic boundaries were being redrawn and many people became stateless, the UN wrote the Refugee Convention in the year of 1951, which is sort of the foundational document. With regard to domestic law, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was very important because it abolished discriminatory national origin admissions quotas that had been in place since 1924 in this country. And more importantly, it opened immigration to non-European migrants. That's the key thing here. Now we have, when people wonder why this administration or that administration isn't doing something more about the flow of immigrants, everybody in this country has to abide by the tenets of the Refugee Act of 1980. It was created for refugees seeking protection, and it creates a system that allows them to demonstrate either past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution on the basis of these 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, and political opinion. Now, the thing that's really important to remember is this system is open to anyone from any country, and anyone may enter legally or illegally and still be able to petition for asylum. Just a very brief historical background on the way asylum works. So as I said, created in the years after the First World War in the context of massive displacement. But this is key. This system was never intended to address mass migration, the numbers that we're seeing come across the border now. It was always to provide humanitarian protection to eligible individuals on a case-by-case basis. Excuse me. So during the Cold War, We had a tendency in this country to give priority to refugees fleeing persecution from communist and socialist-dominated regime. Cuba comes to mind, the Soviet bloc countries. But it's also true that we gave less priority for protection to those who are fleeing right-wing dictatorships, particularly in South America. A perfect example is Haiti with the Duvalier family that were in power from 1957 to 1986, So this is a quotation from the American Immigration Council, which is one of the preeminent think tanks on immigration. We don't have to read the whole thing, but I want you to look at paragraph 2 and 3, because this is really important. Presidential administrations of both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, have failed to meet the challenge of this global refugee crisis. So instead of an orderly system, we've been left with a dysfunctional system that serves the needs of no one. And rather than make a sustained investment in a better system, presidential administrations, again, on the left and the right, have attempted over and over again, particularly in the last 20 years, to use aggressive enforcement and deterrence-based policies in the hope of reducing the number of people who can enter the country and get protection. Alrighty, just very quickly, a lot of Americans, I would imagine, don't understand the difference between a refugee and an asylee. They're individuals who are unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin because of past or future persecution. And those are the grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. The main difference here is the location of the person at the time that they make application. Refugees are almost always vetted outside of the United States, where they're screened for protection. It's an incredibly intensive vetting process. They go through multiple security screenings and background checks, and it's a process that can take from 18 to 24 months before they're allowed to resettle in the United States. Asylees, on the other hand, submit applications while they're physically present in this country. They could be in the interior, or they could be at the border, but they have to express a fear of returning to the place that they left. And very quickly, because I'm going to be referring to the difference between affirmative and defensive cases. So an affirmative case is when a potential asylee is interviewed by an asylum officer associated with Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's a much more relaxed isn't the word, but it's a much less formal venue for someone who's trying to convince an asylum officer that they deserve protection. A defensive case is adjudicated by an immigration judge. They are located in the executive branch, not in the judiciary branch. The agency within which they're housed is the Executive Office for Immigration Review. So as I said, the main elements are harm of a serious nature, well-founded fear of persecution. You'll be thinking about that when you go to sleep tonight, because I will have repeated it so often. And this is really important, nexus. So if you want protection from persecution, you have to, and let's say you're facing violence, you have to link the persecution, the violence, whatever it is, to one of the protected grounds. It's not enough to live in a violent place and have to deal with violence on an everyday basis. You have to be a victim of that violence on the basis of your race, religion, etc., etc. And you've got to be able to prove in some way, or at least convince an immigration judge, that the state was not willing or was unable to protect you. And then this is another thing that most people don't know about. Internal relocation in the country is not reasonable. Most immigration judges, when they hear that someone's been persecuted in a particular place, want proof that they moved to a different area to try and escape the persecution. And finally, there are no bars to eligibility. And I want to emphasize that extensive documentation is required, including identity cards, medical records, witness testimonies, and evidence of the alleged persecution, as we've said in the past or future. Asylum benefits, this is the crown jewel of legal status because it's protection from deportation back to your country of origin. It provides you with work authorization, but only after 6 months. Many people have been reading the stories of sanctuary cities being flooded with asylees, potential asylees, and one of the rubs is They can't work they can't even apply for work authorization until 6 months have passed. Refugees are eligible for government assistance, asylees aren't. But it gives you the opportunity to travel overseas, to have a social security number, but most importantly, to become a legal permanent resident, which puts you on a path to citizenship. All right, why? There is a surge of migrants, fearing extreme insecurity in the Northern Triangle countries. And when I was observing proceedings in the immigration courts along the southern border, most of the people coming across the border were from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Parts of Mexico as well as Nicaragua are also considered the Northern Triangle. So what's the common denominator? Weak rule of law and often violent crime, which the state in question is not in a position or is unwilling or unable to stop. Homicide rates that rival those of war zones. Official corruption, and in the Northern Triangle there's incredible collusion between public officials and criminal groups. And this is really important, the next to last point. This was not true immediately after the Second World War, but within the last 25 years, there's been a proliferation of non-state actors who are persecuting people. Criminal gangs, drug cartels, human traffickers. That's something that has proliferated. And gender-based violence, particularly in the Northern Triangle countries, is horrific. Those three countries that I mentioned, all in various times, are in the top 10 for the number of femicide. And what is a femicide? It's when a woman or a girl is targeted on the basis of her gender. And this is hard for students to hear, but it's really important. Often, their bodies, after they've been murdered, show signs of mutilation and disfigurement beyond what is necessary to end their lives. These are the asylum applicants from the top 10 countries. You can see 80% from these countries. And look at the countries at the very top: Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba, India, Ecuador, Brazil, and Nicaragua. All right, so I want to take a minute and walk you through a successful asylum case that I observed in the Arlington Immigration Court when my husband and I lived in the Washington area. This involved a 15-year-old Guatemalan boy. He lived in a Pentecostal household. His parents were very religious. His father was a pastor. He'd been brought up to have a worldview that respected the rule of law, irrespective of the fact that he lived in a place where there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of lawlessness. On one particular occasion, he happened, and gangs were everywhere in his town of San Benito, Petén. So on one occasion, he saw members of the Mara Salvatrucha gang murder someone who was resisting recruitment. So he went and told his father. His father knew very well that would be a very dangerous thing for him to go and report the crime that he had witnessed to the police department. He did anyhow, being a teenager, and just a couple of days later, he was picked up by the gang members, taken to a field outside his home and shot 5 times. Luckily, there were good Samaritans that passed by, heard the shots, picked him up, took him to the hospital where he had numerous surgeries. But then, about a week later, the hospital staff notified his parents that gang members were walking up and down the halls trying to find him to finish the job. So before he was really ready, they took him out of the hospital. And remember what we said about internal location, moved him to another place in Guatemala, hoping that the gang would not find him. They did. There are incredible networks of gangs all over this country. So once again, he had to leave. And he got across the U.S. border miraculously, despite still suffering from his wounds, with the help of a smuggler. Unfortunately, he was abandoned by the smuggler when his wounds reopened when he was crossing the Sonoran Desert. He was apprehended by Border Patrol. Remember, under 18 years of age. He didn't have identity documents with him, and he wasn't with a parent or a guardian. So he was labeled a UAC, an unaccompanied alien child. And he was detained for 16 months in one of these juvenile detention facilities that I mentioned. He was released to family members in Virginia and had a court hearing that was moved to Arlington from the place where he started in Arizona. He was amazingly, granted asylum on the basis of past and well-founded fear of persecution. It's really unusual for a young person, a 15-year-old, well, he was 16 and a half by the time he was released, to win asylum on the basis of political opinion. But he had very strong anti-gang views and belief in criminal justice, even though he was surrounded by lawlessness. He was also granted asylum on the basis of his membership in a particular social group, that is, young male Guatemalan youth who refuse to join gangs and who initiate police action. The Guatemalan government clearly was unable or unwilling to control the gang and to take police action. So why did he have a positive outcome? He had a superb pro bono attorney from a very well-resourced white shoe law firm, Steptoe and Johnson. His attorney had the wherewithal, had incredible resources. He spent 150 hours preparing that case. They had corroboration from the surgeons in Guatemala. They had an affidavit for the motorist who picked him up. They had multiple examinations of his medical condition. And at the time when he had his asylum hearing, he still had a bullet lodged in his jaw. They also contacted an expert witness who, Dr. Thomas Borman, whose I think this quotation is very powerful, where gangs act as de facto governments because they undermine the state's basic functions. And he had country condition reports from the Department of State, from USAID, from embassy personnel. Everything was covered. Sorry, I've got to take more water. Notwithstanding the excellent preparation that occurred, his claim could very well have been denied if he'd found himself in front of another immigration judge. There's a requirement when you seek asylum that you have to make application within 1 year of entering the country. He wasn't able to even apply for asylum for several years after he was in the United States. But this attorney knew about a waiver that can be extended in exceptional and special circumstances. So the waiver was accepted. He had this. Had he had an attorney with fewer resources, it probably wouldn't have happened. And I want to just point out how much these grant rates differ from one judge to another, from one court to another. The first judge listed here was the judge who heard the case, and there's a wonderful research facility associated with Syracuse University, and they track the grant rates, the denial rates, et cetera. So this judge granted, of all the asylum cases that he saw, granted about 76%, only denied 23. But a colleague of his down the hall had the opposite. He only affirmed 10% and denied 89%. So this young man was extremely fortunate that he got in front of a judge at the Arlington Immigration Court who was not a skeptic about asylum. Challenges to gaining asylum. The first and most important challenge is that anyone who goes into immigration court is not entitled to funded legal representation, even if that person is under 18, even if that person is really young. It is technically a civil system, and that's why there is no equivalent to a public defender that's available and funded by the state. Respondents, that's what they're called in the immigration court. They're not called defendants, thank you. All right, so they have the right to obtain legal representation if they can pay for it. And as you can imagine, most of the people coming from the Northern Triangle countries don't have the wherewithal to hire an immigration attorney, much less be able to find one. And there's a huge shortage of pro bono volunteer attorneys. And this is an important thing to remember about asylum cases. They do resemble death penalty cases, because when people who fear for their lives and have a really credible fear of persecution are forced to leave and return to the place they left because of persecution, it can be a death sentence. Over the last decade, 44% of petitioners with attorneys were granted asylum. That's still low, but it's nothing compared to those who didn't have legal representation. Only 15% of those people got asylum. 60% of non-citizens in immigration court are without legal representation. Another structural obstacle is the organization of the immigration court system itself. As I said before, it's located in the executive branch of the government, not in the judiciary. And immigration judges, just as the prosecuting attorneys, are all under the authority of the same boss, the Attorney General. There are huge power balances that favor these government prosecutors. I attended many master calendar hearings where, of course, you had the judge in his robe. Of course, you had a trial attorney. That's another name for a government attorney who's representing the government. And that person's job was always to argue for removal. And then you had a child sitting over on the right-hand side with no one, or if they were fortunate, a friend of the court. So it's a very unfair system with regard to legal representation. These courts are completely underfunded, and they have chronic staffing shortages, particularly now as the flows of people across the border have increased dramatically. They operate with a 60th of the budget allocated for enforcement agencies. The judges have extremely heavy caseloads, 2,800 cases per judge. There are 659 judges and 70 immigration courts. And that's why, in part, there are huge backlogs. Remember, I mentioned the affirmative asylum petition applications. 1 million people are in that line waiting to have their cases adjudicated. And in the defensive applications in front of the judge in the full immigration court, nearly 1 million. The average asylum case now takes over 4 years to work its way to an outcome. Another structural obstacle is what's called refugee roulette. This was a very famous article that appeared in 2007. One of my colleagues from Georgetown was one of the co-authors. And what they identified, looking at asylum officers, immigration officers, was a huge disparity in grant rates within and across courts. And the asylum decisions depend hugely on the discretion of the judge. If you're the respondent, it's up to you. Hopefully you have legal representation, but it's up to you to present a coherent and cohesive narrative that the judge will buy, particularly if you don't have any evidence that it would corroborate your claim. And it's really interesting that the there have been fascinating studies about the immigration judges themselves. What factors affect the decision? Believe it or not, the background and the gender of the judge, the type of case, the nationality of the asylum seeker, and of course the availability and quality of legal representation and corroborating evidence. And I want to give a very short example of a Ghanaian man. I mentioned that I was a visitation volunteer at one of the worst immigration prisons, and yes, we have the distinction of having it here in Georgia. It's in Lumpkin, Georgia. It's called the Stewart Detention Facility. This young man was very well educated. He came from the West African country of Guinea. And he took part in he joined opposition leaders and was demonstrating against the party in power. And he was beaten savagely by these security forces. He could only get a visa to go to Brazil, so he flew to Brazil and worked his way up the entire continent of South America through the Darien Gap, through Central America, got to and across the U.S. border. Of course, he was apprehended. He incredibly had he had witness affidavits, he had corroborating evidence with him, but he was unlucky enough to get transferred in the immediate weeks after after getting across the border. He passed a credible fear interview and had those medical records, but he was detained and transferred to Stewart Detention Facility. Now, there are trends even within courts, and unfortunately, the Atlanta Immigration Court has one of the highest levels of denials of asylum cases. So that detention center actually has judges on rotation from the Atlanta court that sit in one part of the prison and hear cases and render verdict. This young man had been detained for a year. He presented his case with lots of corroborating evidence, but was denied. He had the ability to petition to appeal. But the Lumpkin immigration judges that rule in that particular setting deny asylum 89% of the time. So he was very unlucky. All right, sorry. So I mentioned this when I was talking about the 2 books that center on unaccompanied minors. A huge structural obstacle are the immigration adjudications for kids under 18. A lot of people don't believe me when I say that very young kids come with other young people, get across the border, and then end up in juvenile detention, federal juvenile detention. Mandatory detention in these facilities and removal proceedings in immigration court. They have no appointed attorneys or guardian ad litem or a child advocate. That is just starting to be recognized by immigration courts in this country. They can make an asylum claim like anyone can, but children are not a protected class under immigration law. So if and when they try and get asylum, they're held to the same standard and the same evidence and credibility standards as adults. And unlike domestic law, even as flawed as our juvenile courts are, there is absolutely no consideration of a child's best interest as the primary reason for giving him or her legal relief. There is no allowance made for developmental immaturity, for cultural incompetence, or for special vulnerabilities. So, and there are no safeguards for children with mental disorders or cognitive impairments. So the stakes are really stacked against young people who end up in immigration court. So we've just talked about some of the structural flaws. Now I want to talk about the role that partisan politics, unfortunately, play in immigration law and policy. I'm going to mostly be talking about asylees, but this is one piece that's really important to see. With regard to refugees, the president every year, in theory, consults with Congress to establish a refugee admission ceiling. Excuse me. And since 1980, the average of people who were admitted, remember, who are vetted outside the country, allowed to resettle and admitted, was about 73,000 for a year. In 1993, that ceiling went up under the Clinton administration because of conflicts across the world. It came down again under President Obama. The ceiling was set in 2017 at 110,000 for the year. There was an historic low during the Trump administration of 15,000. No one had ever seen an admissions ceiling that low. Now, when the Biden administration came in, they raised the ceiling to 125,000. But because of the disruptions of the COVID restrictions, it's been really slow reviving the resettlement process. This year, there have been so far 60,000 people. The 60,000 people have actually been admitted as refugees. Another partisan example, again, Congress makes immigration law. Don't ever forget that. The last comprehensive immigration reform we had was in 1996. And I want to point out one particular part of that law which is really particularly harsh. It's called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. And what it did was expand the categories of deportable offenses to include nonviolent misdemeanors, which is a standard that U.S. citizens are certainly not held to. And this is the part that's really harsh, that those offenses the penalties are applied retroactively to include acts that were committed at any time in a person's life. And it furthermore increased the types of offenses, redefined aggravated felonies to include a crime with a penalty of jail time of 1 year or longer. So if you're convicted of an aggravated felony under immigration law, you are prohibited from most forms of relief, including asylum, and from being readmitted to the country. The other thing that it did was eliminate the discretion of the immigration judge in cases where there were aggravated felonies and other serious offenses. Here's another example of changing immigration law and policy. This is a case known as the matter of A.B., Mrs. A.B. She fled El Salvador after enduring severe domestic violence at the hands of her ex-husband and father of her children for 15 years. She got away, got over the border, and asked for asylum. She was granted asylum on appeal. There are the immigration courts, and then the next highest tribunal is the Bureau of Immigration Appeals. That was in 2004. Well, one of the first things that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, did was issue a binding opinion known as matter of A versus B that excluded domestic abuse and gang violence from the types of persecution that are recognized under U.S. law. And what's really interesting is that the Attorney General has the power to completely reverse settled law and, in this case, to exclude one of the basic grounds that Central American, particularly women, face. Flip-flop. The Biden administration comes in, and the Attorney General Merrick Garland reversed the Sessions decision, and once again, domestic violence and gang violence are again accepted as grounds for protection. I'm sorry. So we've talked about structural, we've talked about partisan politics. There are very serious deterrence measures that have a restrictive effect on asylum. And I just looked at the most recent period, or we'd be here until 1 o'clock. So the zero tolerance policy that was initiated by the Attorney General Sessions, was really dramatic because what it did was criminalize all entries, all people, all migrants who were crossing the border. It called for not only their criminal prosecution, but the jailing. Everyone has heard about the separation of families at the border, I hope. This was a policy that was pursued by the Trump administration that was particularly cruel because when families presented at the border, immigration officials immediately separated the parents, took them to jail, and prosecuted them for a criminal offense. And they took the children and, in theory, transferred them to these closed facilities that I mentioned under the authority of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But unfortunately, the way it was rolled out was so chaotic and so disorganized that the people who run the shelters didn't know that rule had been put in place until they heard media talking about it. So it was a completely chaotic. It was cruel, but it was also completely chaotic in its implementation. And over 5,000 families were affected by that separation. It only lasted for about 5 or 6 months, but horrific harm and damage was done to these families. Interestingly, as the Biden administration created an investigative task force, and have been working to try and reunify parents. Some of the parents, instead of being jailed, were deported immediately, and some of the kids were sent to foster care families. And when those facilities overflowed with children, they dumped them in repurposed warehouses where there were no facilities of any kind. So another deterrence measure a year later was misnamed the Migration Protection Protocols, and in fact it was remained in Mexico. So this particular policy required asylum seekers, when they came to the border, weren't allowed in. They had to go back and wait in Mexico to be notified of a possible court hearing. And they were trapped along the border, the southern border, where drug cartels and criminal gangs are very active. There were not enough facilities in Mexico for them to be housed in a safe fashion, so they ended up being stuck in squalid tent camps where there was no water, there were no sanitation facilities. So these three are part of very, very harsh deterrence mechanisms. Title 42, everyone has heard about. It's an emergency health provision that closed the ports of entry ostensibly because of the pandemic, to all entrants, including asylum seekers and unaccompanied children. And it expelled migrants, again, back to Mexico or to the country that they fled. There were also expedited credible fear interviews that were done by phone. Well, you can imagine if someone has fled horrific violence or persecution, trying to explain this to an asylum officer on a cell phone is particularly difficult. also because many of these interviews were done in Customs and Border Patrol stations. The last one, I have to always look at, it makes no sense to me when I read it. This is something that the Biden administration just put in place called this circumvention of lawful pathways. It too has been dubbed an asylum ban because it's a sort of variation. Now that Title 42 has ended, it ended in May of this year, this is a kind of redux of the Title 42 because it requires migrants to schedule asylum screening appointments using a CBP app on their cell phones. It requires that they have a cell phone. It requires that they're close to some place that has electricity. And the system, when it was rolled out, was incredibly glitchy. There were dropped calls all the time. Sometimes the calls never went through. And the Biden administration has touted the fact that it's making possible 1,400 screening appointments every day. In fact, it's not possible because of the deficiencies of the cell phones and others. But this is the real stick. Without making one of those screening appointments, if individuals manage to try and cross the border, then they're automatically ineligible for asylum and are deported. Another incredibly harsh deterrence mechanism that was expanded under President Obama beginning in 2014. And this was still in effect, the immigration detention system. It's expensive and it's inhumane. Remember what we said, it's technically a civil detention system, but the conditions in the private prisons where these people, asylum seekers for the most part, end up are frequently worse than in state and federal prisons. And they are not legally required under American law. And President Biden, when he was, during his presidential campaign, these are, for the most part, for-profit private prisons. He pledged to do away with for-profit private prisons. So one of the first things that he did was issue an executive order telling the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, no more contracts with private prisons. But what he didn't say was that it didn't include immigration prisons. They're extremely expensive. Your tax dollars at work, it's $143 a day to keep someone in immigration detention, $320 a day to keep a family unit in prison. There's very little federal oversight. There are no meaningful grievance processes. Basic health care is inadequate or non-existent. And I will just give you one example. Back to that conference in 2017, one of the immigration attorneys mentioned a case of a mother whose 5-year-old was spitting up blood and couldn't get the guards to do anything about it. That kid spit up blood for 5 days before they finally relented and allowed the child to be sent to an emergency room for care. There are rampant due process violations in these prisons, widespread abuse, and very arbitrary rules and harsh punishments for seemingly insignificant things. Again, a very brief example. One of the women who was featured in the book that I've written called Forced Out was nearly killed twice when she was trying to get to the United States, swept off the top of a cargo train and shattered her foot. Then later, when she was recovered, she was lucky enough to get into a migrant housing facility in Mexico. Then nearly died because her foot, she just couldn't keep up with the group with whom she was trying to get through the desert. So she was picked up, taken to a hospital. Border Patrol agents took her to a hospital, shackled her to the bed, and then transferred her to an immigration prison. Well, gave her a prison uniform and took away her meds. But at the same time, she saw someone from home and ran to hug that person, and then found herself in solitary confinement in a freezing cell. It was only later that she discovered that one of the prison rules is that you can't touch anyone. So very arbitrary rules. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, detains 30,000 people per day, and 9 out of 10 of the people in ICE detention are held in those private for-profit prisons. This detention system is very expensive. It's $2.9 billion this year, $442 million. One thing that the Biden administration has done is encourage more alternatives to detention, like ankle monitors and Smart Link, again, through a cell phone, which monitors everywhere you go. All right, who is detained? As I've said, family units stopped being, that was one of the things that the Biden administration did soon after coming into office, was ending the detention of family units. But the detention of single adults and unaccompanied children has continued apace. And again, another statistic about how difficult it is to get asylum without legal representation. And this list of problems I've seen myself as a visitation volunteer in 2 prisons, in our Irwin detention facility that mercifully was closed in 2019 because immigrant mothers were being sterilized without their consent. So they were switched to Stewart Detention Facility, but a number of people who have been visitation volunteers can vouch for this. Racist taunts and physical assaults, infliction of solitary confinement up to 23 hours a day for really minor infractions, denial of basic health care. There are no educational opportunities, very limited recreation, visitations via telephone behind a plastic screen, no cell phones, no food or drink are permitted, and most of the people in these prisons have no legal representation. The conclusion that I have come to, and that I hope that you will share after hearing this, is that these deterrence measures are ineffective in limiting migration, but certainly effective in restricting asylum protection. Now, I just want us to step back and think about who we are as a nation and what percentage of immigrants comprise the population here. Worldwide, the U.S. is home to more international migrants than any other country. And while we only represent 5% of the total world population, we have close to 20% of all global migrants living in this country. And compare the percentage of immigrants to the total U.S. population in 1890. 14.8% compared to 13.6% now. So it's not as bad as it may seem to some people. And I've only given the origin of immigrants here to point out that as a result of the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965, the numbers from Latin America and Asia are a sharp turnaround from the 1900s. This is a little dated, it's 2019, but you get a visual depiction of the naturalized citizens of lawful or legal permanent residents. Non-immigrants are people who have come on work visas or school visas. And then you'll see that of that whole pie, approximately 23% are unauthorized. And we can talk about DACA if you'd like, if my voice holds out. We have seen a decline in asylum grant rates, not surprisingly. In 2019, 45,900 asylum grants. There were that number of asylum grants. 2020, it went down to 31,000. And Justin mentioned that in 2021, only 17,700 migrants were granted asylum. Now, the asylum numbers have gone up in 2023. But with the introduction just in May of this new CBP app and the punitive restrictions that will be placed on people seeking protection, they're certain to go down. All right, solutions. This is probably very egotistically of me to try and come up with solutions, but I think it's worth thinking about. We haven't had comprehensive reform of the immigration system by Congress since 1996. We came close in 2013 when there was a really good bill that passed the Senate that had both measures for border security as well as some important rights like funding legal representation for young people, for those youth under 18 that I mentioned. Unfortunately, it wasn't even brought to the floor of the House of Representatives because John Boehner refused to bring it to the floor. We need to create new pathways to legal status and to extend the categories for family reunification. The only way you can get into this country now is from family reunification. And our rules are very stringent. Only immediate family members can be sponsored. That is, a spouse, an unmarried child under 21, or parents. Everyone else in the immediate family circle is subject to caps, annual caps. There are currently 5 statutory bases. We've heard this already a number of times. That's inadequate. The system was designed in the 20th century, and we have 21st century reality. And as I said before, non-state actors target specific groups based on their gender. So we have to rethink the entire system because most people agree that it's completely broken. We have to fund legal representation. It would be a very hard sell to do it for adults across the board, especially given the number of people who are coming. However, if we had legal representation, if we took part of those billions of dollars and invested in legal representation, the immigration court system would be more efficient, it would be fairer. So I think it's a no-brainer to suggest that we need more legal representation for people seeking asylum and for young people under 18. We need to fund more asylum officers and immigration judges. There have been a number of studies that compare the stress levels of immigration judges to air traffic controllers and emergency physicians in emergency rooms. And having sat in that many hours of immigration proceedings, particularly the merit proceedings, those are the proceedings when the whole case for asylum has to be laid out. I felt that I was developing PTSD by listening to these horrific stories, and then imagine doing that every day, all day. It takes a toll on people's compassion, quota, as well as their health, mental health and physical health. I think if we can agree on anything, it would be to end immigration detention, except obviously for those people who are charged with criminal offenses. It is not a redeemable system. It's much too flawed. We should move the immigration court system out of the executive branch and into the judiciary. As I've mentioned, the power imbalances that affect judges. I don't think I mentioned this, but the prosecuting attorneys in the immigration court, they are the ones who bring the cases. They open the cases for removal. They are the ones who determine release, when and under what conditions. They are the ones who essentially provide the facts of the case. And immigration judges have no contempt authority. So, and I have seen that too. These trial attorneys who would arrive late, not have the files, not be prepared, and then that would involve a continuance and the whole court reconvening again. On the other hand, defense attorneys in the immigration court system can indeed be censured and even disbarred if they do unprofessional things. We need more funding for local and state governments. As we've all seen, buses that have begun in Texas and Florida filled with migrants who were given disinformation. And we know it was a political stunt and it was meant to embarrass the Biden administration and to put sanctuary cities under the spotlight too, because it was very clear when people, tens of thousands of people were going to sanctuary cities that they weren't in a position to handle them. And the system has always been, when people are released from Customs and Border Protection, there are NGOs there, and under normal circumstances, they can handle the people who are released. They can put them on buses, they can help them get to where they have family, and then go from there. And we have to reallocate funds from the border wall construction. $14 billion was devoted to border wall construction. And whenever I see those statistics, I think of Janet Napolitano, who's the former governor of Arizona is now the president of the University of California system, and her famous take on this was, you show me a 50-foot wall, I'll show you a 52-foot ladder. And she was being somewhat facetious, but that's exactly, people who are fleeing horrific violence will find a way. So, I'm sorry, my voice has about had it, but that's all I have. Thank you.
I have a microphone for those who'd like to ask Susan some questions, so just raise your hand.
I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to continue.
We'll
I'm sorry.
3 questions. Okay, I'll run to the... Let's do this first one.
Hi. Do you believe children should be granted status as a protected group under asylum law, and would that aid in the acceptance of them as asylum seekers?
Actually, I don't think that they should be accepted as a protected class for asylum. I think they should be given legal representation, and I think the rules for asylum have to be reconfigured to be fairer and for it, not to be so dependent on case-by-case adjudications. But I am very supportive of unaccompanied children. They are perhaps the most vulnerable population, and for that reason they deserve not only legal representation, but guidance from a child advocate in the immigration court. And I would further add, a number of immigration judges that I was lucky enough to interview felt that they should not even be in immigration court until they were over 14 years of age. I have seen kids this tall standing alone on the right side of the court because they don't have legal representation, and there is developmental immaturity that works against them. So I agree with that judge that they shouldn't even be in immigration court under the age of 14.
Thank you for being here tonight. You mentioned that we're a destination country, even though we have all these backlogs in asylum. What other countries around the world is doing it better than us, and what can we learn from them?
That's a huge question, and I don't know whether I have the voice power to respond. I think one of our closest neighbors, Canada, is doing it better than we are, certainly. But the trend of wanting the country of origin, the sending country, to be part of a migration control system is really problematic, because what we are doing and other Western European countries are doing, the UK is doing, Australia is certainly doing, is outsourcing interdiction so that people cannot even get into the country without first trying to seek asylum in a third country and having it denied, and then they can come across the border. I think the whole world is trending toward a more punitive and a more inflexible system, and I'm sorry to say that.
Hi, I'm kind of conflicted because my family has come from Venezuela illegally, and they're already going to get a green card and Social Security. And when I worked at immigration, people that were trying to come in legally had to wait years.
Exactly.
So it's very unfair to me to see these people who have family here and who will support them having to wait years to get into this country. And I want your opinion on that.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. One of the sort of Band-Aid solutions that the Biden administration tried with Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Cubans was to allow, across those 4 countries, 30,000 a month to come into the U.S. and be able to get work authorization not before 6 months, and to be protected from deportation. But the flip side of that most people don't know is they'll take 30,000 in and they'll deport 30,000. So it was a kind of a zero-sum game. I think that your relatives were very fortunate. It's a problem. It really is. And because there has been no comprehensive immigration reform, various administrations can just use executive orders to sort of treat the edges of the system and not really to have any profound impact. I'm sorry, I don't think I can answer any more.
Thank you, Susan. We have one announcement from Kevin Goldberg.
So, Dr. Terrio, thank you very much for that informative and solutions-oriented presentation. That was wonderful. I do want to make one quick announcement. So my name is Kevin Goldberg. I'm a member director of the Savannah Council. I would like to ask everybody just to circle a date on their calendar, Thursday, January 11th. We are bringing back Trivia Night to the council. Yes. So it'll be fun. It's going to be in this building. We think at about 6 o'clock. It's going to begin with food and drink, and then it's going to end with trivia, competitive trivia for prizes. There's also going to be a silent auction. So Thursday, January 11th, we hope to see you all there. We'll have more information about it at our next meeting.
Thank you for coming, and have a happy Thanksgiving. If you would like to take a chair over to the rack over there, it'd be great. But if not, we'll do it. Okay. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Thank you, Susan.